The sky over the Montana Territory was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and sullen yellow at the edges. Rain hadn't yet fallen, but the air was thick with the promise of it, heavy and wet against the skin. For Elspeth, each breath was a ragged effort, a counterpoint to the relentless rhythm of her struggle. The splintered wood of the crutch handles dug into her palms, raw and blistered. The ache in her left leg, bound tight in a makeshift splint, had long ago escalated from a sharp protest to a dull, thunderous roar that echoed all the way up her spine. Thump, swing, drag. Thump, swing, drag. The rhythm was her world. The thump of the crutches hitting the rocky trail. The agonizing swing of her good leg forward. The pathetic, dragging sound of her injured leg following behind. She had been moving in this excruciating cadence for what felt like an eternity, but the sun's slow crawl across the bruised sky told her it had been most of the day. 20 miles. The man at the way station had said it was 20 miles to Hallows Creek. He'd said it with pity in his eyes, a look she had come to despise more than open cruelty. Pity was a soft, suffocating blanket, and she was fighting for air. Her dress, once a hopeful ivory poplin meant for a wedding, was now a tattered gray shroud, ripped at the hem and stained with mud and sweat. It clung to her unpleasantly, a constant reminder of the foolish girl who had packed it with trembling, excited hands 1,000 miles away in Ohio. That girl was gone, lost somewhere in the wreckage of snapped wagon axle and the subsequent, chilling dismissal in a man's eyes. Mr. Abernathy, her intended. He had looked at her mangled leg, then at her face, and his own had closed like a shop door at the end of the day. A cripple's no good to anyone, he'd stated, not with malice, but with the flat finality of a man calculating inventory. He had paid the way station keeper a few dollars to see her put on the next eastbound stage and had ridden off toward his prosperous life in Hallows Creek without a backward glance. But the eastbound stage wasn't due for a week. And in the meantime, the rain had come. Not a gentle spring shower, but a deluge, a biblical torrent that had lasted for 2 solid days. The river had swelled, and yesterday, the way station keeper, a frantic, weathered man with a family to protect, had pointed a trembling finger at the distant mountains. The Beartooth Dam. She ain't built for this. If that wall goes, Hallows Creek is in the flood path. They sit too low. They won't even know it's coming. He was packing his wagon, fleeing to high ground. He'd offered her a place, but his wagon was already overflowing with children and belongings. She would have been one more burden, another mouth to feed, a cripple to slow them down. So she had made a choice. She could wait for a stagecoach that might never come, wait for the flood to wash away the memory of her existence. Or she could do the one thing she had left the power to do. She could walk. She could warn them. She could warn the man who had discarded her and the town that didn't know she existed. It wasn't about saving him. It was about saving herself, the part of her that refused to be defined by a broken bone and a broken promise. It was an act of defiance aimed at the uncaring sky, at the cruel twist of fate, at the man who had judged her worthless. Every agonizing step was a testament. I'm still here. I am worth more than you think. Well, that's a tough way to start a new life. Before we see if Elspeth can possibly finish this grueling journey, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. The path was growing steeper now, winding through a copse of whispering aspens whose leaves trembled in the charged air. She paused, leaning her forehead against the cool, smooth bark of a tree, her chest heaving. The 20 miles had been an abstract horror, but the reality was a collection of a million tiny agonies. The sharp stone that turned under her good foot, the branch that snagged her sleeve, the constant, grinding pain. She knew she was losing time. The air smelled of wet earth and ozone, and far off, a low rumble vibrated through the soles of her worn-out boots. It wasn't thunder. It was the voice of the river, angry and swollen. She pushed off the tree, squared her shoulders, and took another step. Then another. She would not be broken. She would not be discarded. She would walk into Hallows Creek, a ghost in a ruined wedding dress. and she would shout her warning until her throat was raw. And then, whatever happened, she would have done something that mattered. She rounded a large granite boulder that blocked the view ahead, and her heart seized, stopping cold in her chest. The trail ended. Before her was not a path, but a chasm. What was likely a manageable creek most seasons was now a churning, muddy torrent, 50 feet across, a furious brown snake devouring its banks and carrying whole branches in its maw. The noise was a deafening roar. There was no bridge, no crossing, no hope. She was cut off. Hallows Creek lay somewhere on the other side of that liquid rage, close enough to imagine, but impossible to reach. For the first time since she'd started, a sob of pure despair tore from her throat. It was a thin, hopeless sound, swallowed immediately by the river's roar. She had come all this way, endured all this pain, only to fail at the final hurdle. The bruised sky seemed to press down on her, and the weight of it all, the journey, the rejection, the futility, finally brought her to her knees in the mud. Silas Blackwood was not a man given to flights of fancy. His world was one of solid, tangible things. The heft of an axe, the warmth of his horse, the unyielding granite of the mountains that walled in his ranch. He lived by the rhythms of the sun and the seasons. His solitude, a comfortable coat he had worn for so long it felt like a second skin. His wife, Sarah, had been gone 5 years, taken by a winter fever that had paid no mind to his strength or his love. Since then, his conversations had been mostly with his horse, Buck, and the wind. His ranch was a modest affair, nestled in a high meadow that was safe from the tantrums of the creek below. But the ceaseless rain had put him on edge. It wasn't fear, but a deep, ingrained caution. He trusted the mountains, but he didn't trust the water. Water was patient, and it was hungry. That morning, the creek's usual murmur had become a growl that vibrated up through the bedrock. He'd spent the day securing his small herd of cattle in the highest pasture and reinforcing the walls of his barn. Now, with the sky threatening to finally break, he rode Buck along the ridge overlooking the torrent, checking for erosion, for any sign the land itself was giving way. His life was a closed loop of hard work and quiet memory. The town of Hallows Creek, 20 miles downstream, was a place he visited twice a year for supplies. He had little use for its gossip, its petty squabbles, its church socials. The people there were shadows, their lives as distant to him as the moon. He knew about the Bear-Tooth Dam, of course. Knew it was an old structure built with more optimism than engineering. He'd shaken his head at the town council's refusal to fund its repair last year, but it wasn't his business. His business was his land, his animals, his solitude. As he reined Buck in at the edge of the overlook, his gaze swept the opposite bank of the creek out of habit. He saw nothing but rain-darkened pines and slick, gray rock. Then he scanned his own side, tracing the path that led from the old way station. And then he saw it, a patch of white against the dun-colored mud. It wasn't an animal. It moved. He squinted, his curiosity piqued. It was a person, a woman. She was on her knees, her head bowed, a figure of absolute desolation. From this distance, she looked like a broken doll cast aside by a careless child. He could make out the strange shape of Crutches lying in the mud beside her. What in the name of God was a woman, a crippled woman at that, doing out here in the middle of nowhere on the edge of a flood? A scornful thought, quick and unwelcome, flickered through his mind. Some fool from town, lost and panicked. It had nothing to do with him. He could turn Buck around, ride back to the warmth of his cabin, and let the world handle its own fools. He had his own life to manage. But Sarah's face swam in his memory for a moment. Her belief in the quiet decencies, the small kindnesses that held the world together. He let out a gruff sigh, a sound of resignation that fogged in the damp air. It was his business. Cursing under his breath, he nudged Buck forward, picking his way down the steep, treacherous slope toward the kneeling figure. As he drew closer, the details sharpened into a portrait of pure misery. The dress was a wedding gown, or had been. It was ruined. Her hair, a rich chestnut brown, was matted with leaves and dirt. Her shoulders shook with silent, exhausted sobs. He dismounted a dozen feet away, the soft thud of his boots masked by the river's roar. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. It came out louder than he intended, a harsh bark against the chaos of the water. Elspeth's head snapped up, her eyes, wide and startled, were the color of moss, rimmed with red from weeping. For a terrifying second, she thought Abernathy had come back for her, and her heart hammered with a fresh wave of humiliation. But this man was nothing like the portly, soft-handed shopkeeper. He was tall and broad, carved from the same hard material as the mountains around them. His face was weathered, framed by a dark beard, and his eyes were a startling, clear gray, like a winter sky. They held no pity, only a kind of stark, questioning intensity. She scrambled backward in the mud, trying to regain some semblance of dignity. "Stay back," she croaked, her voice raw. Silas held up a hand, palm open. "Not here to harm you. Just want to know why you're trying to get yourself killed." The bluntness of his words cut through her fear, replaced by a spike of the familiar anger that had fueled her journey. "I'm not trying to get killed," she snapped, shoving a stray strand of wet hair from her face. "I'm trying to get to Hallows Creek. The dam, the Beartooth Dam, is going to break. The whole valley is going to flood." Silas's expression didn't change, but his gray eyes sharpened. He'd had the same thought, the same fear, but hearing it from this half-drowned stranger gave it a terrifying immediacy. "How do you know?" "The man at the way station. He saw the cracks widening. He took his family and fled this morning. He said no one in town listens, that they think the dam will hold." She gestured wildly across the impassable river with a muddy hand. "They have to be warned." He looked from her desperate, earnest face to the furious water, then back again. He saw the crude splint on her leg, the raw skin of her hands, the sheer, bloody-minded determination that must have carried her this far. This was no panicked fool. This was something else entirely. This was courage, raw and painful to witness. "You came all this way on that leg?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, her chin trembling. "I had to." He looked at the crutches, then at her exhausted frame. The absurdity of it was almost comical, if it weren't so damn tragic. A woman in a ruined wedding dress, on crutches, trying to outrun a flood to warn a town that probably wouldn't believe her. He felt a stir of something he hadn't felt in years. A fierce, protective anger at the sheer unfairness of it all. Her body chose that moment to betray her. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the world tilting violently. The last of her strength evaporated, and she swayed, her eyes rolling back in her head. Silas moved faster than he thought he still could, closing the distance in 2 long strides and catching her before she collapsed face first into the mud. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile collection of bone and grit. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breathing shallow. He stood there for a long moment, holding this strange, fierce woman in his arms, the roar of the creek filling the silence between them. He had come out to check his fences, to secure his solitary world against the storm. Now, that world had been breached. He looked up at the darkening sky, then down at the unconscious woman. He made a decision. With a grunt of effort, he scooped her up into his arms, bridal style, an irony that was not lost on him, and carried her toward his horse. His cabin was warm. His world was no longer just his own. The journey back up the ridge was a slow, arduous process. Silas led Buck with one hand, cradling Elspeth securely against his chest with the other arm. She was a dead weight, fully surrendered to the exhaustion her body had been screaming for. Her head rested in the crook of his shoulder, and with every step, he felt the fragile warmth of her, a stark contrast to the cold, damp air. He was acutely aware of the unfamiliarity of the feeling. It had been a lifetime since he had held anyone but himself. He deposited her gently onto his own bed inside the small, sturdy cabin. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace where embers still glowed. The space was meticulously neat but Spartan. A bed, a solid oak table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with preserves and tools, and a worn leather armchair by the hearth. It was the home of a man who expected nothing and wasted nothing. Elspeth stirred as he laid her down, a low moan escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. "Where?" "My cabin," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're safe from the storm." He pulled a thick wool blanket over her, tucking it around her shoulders. "You need to get out of those wet things." A flush of color rose in her cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and defiance. "I can manage." She tried to push herself up, but a sharp intake of breath and the whitening of her knuckles as she gripped the blanket told him otherwise. Silas sighed, a sound of weary patience. "Look, ma'am." "Elspeth," she whispered. "Elspeth," he repeated, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "You've done more than any 10 men would have. There's no shame in letting someone help you now." He gestured to a small wooden chest at the foot of the bed. "There are some of my wife's things in there. They'll be too big for you, but they're dry and warm. I'll be outside, tending to my horse. I won't come in until you call." He didn't wait for an answer, just turned and walked out, closing the door firmly behind him. The gesture of trust was so simple, so absolute, that it disarmed her completely. Left alone in the quiet warmth of the cabin, the sounds of the storm and the roaring creek muted by the thick log walls, Elspeth felt the last of her defenses crumble. Slowly, painfully, she shed the ruined wedding dress, the symbol of her failed hopes, and let it fall into a heap on the floor. She found a simple flannel nightgown in the chest. It smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, a ghost of a scent from a life lived in this quiet place. As she slipped it on, the soft fabric of balm against her cold skin, the sheer emotional and physical weight of the past 2 days crashed down on her. She lay back against the pillows, and for the first time in what felt like a year, she wept. Not the sob of despair by the river, but a deep, cleansing release of pain, humiliation, and terror. Outside, Silas worked with mechanical efficiency, rubbing Buck down, giving him fresh hay and water. But his mind was inside the cabin. He could hear her soft weeping through the door, and each sound was a small blow against the walls he had built around his heart. He thought of Abernathy, the town merchant, and a cold, hard anger settled in his gut. To cast aside a woman of such mettle for the sake of convenience, it was a brand of cowardice he couldn't comprehend. When the sounds from inside quieted, he hesitated for a moment before knocking softly. "Elspeth." A small, muffled "come in" was his answer. She was sitting up in the bed, the oversized nightgown swallowing her small frame. Her face was scrubbed clean from her tears, pale but composed. Her wet hair was unbound, falling in dark waves around her shoulders. She looked younger than he had first thought, and incredibly vulnerable. He moved to the hearth, adding logs to the fire until it blazed to life, casting flickering shadows across the room. "I need to look at that leg," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She flinched but nodded, extending her leg from beneath the blanket. The splint was a crude affair of scavenged sticks and strips of her petticoat. Silas worked carefully, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he unwrapped the bindings. The flesh beneath was swollen and discolored, a nasty tapestry of purple and blue. "It's not broken clean through," he murmured, his fingers probing lightly. "But you've torn something fierce in the ligaments." And walking on it, he shook his head, a flicker of grudging admiration in his eyes. "You're lucky you didn't lose the whole leg." He cleaned the cuts and scrapes with a rag and hot water from the kettle, then expertly fashioned a new, more stable splint from smooth planks of pine and clean strips of canvas. As he worked, the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. "Why were you in a wedding dress?" he finally asked, not looking at her, his focus entirely on his task. The question hung in the air. She could lie, could invent a story that painted her in a better light. But looking at the quiet competence of this man, the simple decency of his care, a lie felt like an insult. "I was supposed to be married," she said, her voice flat, "to a Mr. Abernathy in Hallows Creek. A mail-order arrangement. Our wagon from the stage stop hit a rock. The driver was thrown, and the wagon overturned on my leg. Mr. Abernathy decided I was damaged goods. He paid my way back east and left me, at the way station. Silas finished tying the last knot on the splint and sat back on his heels. He looked up at her, and his gray eyes were like chips of flint. "He just left you." He said a cripple was no use to him. She whispered, the words still tasting like ash in her mouth. Silas said nothing for a long time. He simply stared into the fire, his jaw tight. The crackling of the logs was the only sound. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and serrated. "He's a fool." It wasn't a compliment or a reassurance. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unyielding as the stone of his fireplace. And in that moment, hearing that simple declaration from this stranger, Elspeth felt a small, broken piece of her spirit begin to knit itself back together. He stood up, his movements stiff. "You're hungry. I'll make some stew." As he moved about the cabin, gathering potatoes, onions, and jerky, a strange sense of domesticity settled over them. They were two strangers, trapped by a storm, united by a shared, impossible goal. Elspeth watched him, her earlier fear replaced by a deep, powerful curiosity. He moved with an economy of motion, a man entirely at home in his environment. She noted the carefully repaired handle of a skillet, the neat stack of firewood, the way he paused to look out the single window toward the creek, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a man who fixed what was broken, who faced problems head-on. They ate the stew in near silence at the small table. It was simple, hearty, and the most delicious thing Elspeth had ever tasted. The warmth spread through her, chasing away the last of the chill. The storm raged outside, the wind howling around the eaves of the cabin like a hungry wolf, but inside, by the fire, there was a small pocket of peace. "The water's still rising," Silas said, breaking the quiet. He had been staring out the window again. "Even if the dam holds, that creek won't be crossable for days." Elspeth's newfound peace evaporated. "But we don't have days. If the dam keeper was right." "I know," Silas cut in, his voice grim. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of frustration. "I know." He got up and began to pace the length of the small cabin, a caged tiger of a man. His solitude had been his fortress, but now it was his prison. He was one man against a force of nature. He stopped and looked at her, at the fierce hope that still burned in her moss-green eyes despite everything. She hadn't given up. How could he? Suddenly, a sound unlike the wind or the rain reached them. It was a deep, guttural rumble that came from far up the valley, a vibration that seemed to travel through the very floorboards of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it was immense, the sound of something foundational giving way. They looked at each other, the same terrible knowledge dawning in their eyes. "The dam," Elspeth breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. Silas didn't need to confirm it. He had heard the groan of stressed earth and stone before. He strode to the door and threw it open, ignoring the lash of wind and rain. He stared out into the maelstrom, listening. The roar of the creek had changed. It was deeper, angrier, and it was getting louder with every passing second. The flood was no longer a threat. It was a reality. A wall of water was at this very moment tearing its way down the valley toward Hallows Creek. The window to warn them had just slammed shut. The minutes after the sound of the dam's collapse were stretched thin and tight, like a wire about to snap. The immediate, deafening roar of the creek intensified, a constant reminder of the catastrophic force now unleashed. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up Elspeth's throat, but the look on Silas's face held it at bay. His expression had settled into a kind of grim, focused mask. The time for worry was over. The time for action had arrived, however impossible that action might seem. "How long?" Elspeth asked, her voice barely a whisper above the storm's fury. "How long until it reaches the town?" Silas closed the door, shutting out the chaos for a moment. He ran a quick calculation in his head, factoring in the terrain, the width of the valley, the sheer volume of water a burst dam would release. An hour, maybe less. The main surge will move fast. An hour, 60 minutes to cross an impassable river and cover the remaining miles to Hallows Creek. A hopeless, desperate laugh escaped Elspeth's lips. "It's impossible." "Nothing's impossible," Silas countered, his voice sharp with a sudden, fierce energy. "It's just hard." He began to move with a purpose that electrified the small cabin. He wasn't pacing anymore. He was gathering, planning. He pulled a thick, coiled rope from a peg on the wall. He grabbed a heavy, double-bit axe, its head honed to a razor's edge. He checked the blade of a long crosscut saw. Elspeth watched him, her bewilderment turning to a dawning, incredulous understanding. He wasn't surrendering. He was going to fight. "What are you doing?" she asked. He stopped, turning to face her, his gray eyes burning with an intense light. "That water is the enemy. But the land can be an ally if you know how to use it." He walked to the window and pointed out into the rain-swept gloom. "See that big pine? The one on the cliff edge, right over the narrowest part of the channel." Elspeth followed his finger. Through the deluge, she could just make out the silhouette of a massive, ancient pine tree, its trunk thick as a barrel, standing sentinel on their side of the raging creek. Directly across from it, on the far bank, stood another giant, its twin. The gap between them, though filled with a churning hell of water, was indeed the narrowest point she had seen. "I see it," she said, her voice laced with confusion. "If I could drop that tree," Silas said, his voice low and steady, "and if it falls true, it'll span the gap. It'll be a bridge." The audacity of the plan stole her breath. To fell a tree of that size with precision, in a storm, with time running out, it was a gamble of epic proportions. 1,000 things could go wrong. The tree could splinter, it could fall short, it could be swept away the moment it hit the water. But as she looked at Silas's face, at the set of his jaw, and the unwavering certainty in his eyes, she felt a flicker of impossible hope. He wasn't just a rancher. He was a force of nature in his own right. "It's dangerous," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "Staying here is a death sentence for those people in town," he retorted. "Dangerous is our only option." He slung the rope over his shoulder and picked up the axe. "I'm going to need your help. My help." She looked down at her splinted leg, a bitter reminder of her own uselessness. "What can I possibly do?" "You're going to be my eyes," he said, his tone all business. "The wind is tricky. I'll need to make a wedge cut, but I need to know how the gusts are shifting. When I'm ready to make the final cut, you'll watch the top of the tree. You'll shout if the wind shifts hard. It could throw the fall off by 20 feet. He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "And I need you to hold the rope. It's just a guideline, but I need it anchored. I need to know it's secure. Can you do that?" He wasn't offering her a token task to make her feel useful. He was giving her a critical role, a piece of the responsibility. He was treating her not as a cripple, but as a partner. In that moment, her admiration for this quiet, steadfast man solidified into something deeper, something fiercely loyal. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I can do that." The world outside the cabin was a primal chaos of wind, water, and noise. The rain came down in slanted, silver sheets, instantly soaking them. The ground was slick, treacherous mud. Silas half-carried, half-supported Elspeth to a relatively sheltered spot beneath a rock outcropping, a safe distance from the pine, but with a clear view. He handed her the coiled end of the heavy rope. "Don't wrap it around your hands," he instructed, his voice raised to a shout over the storm. "Just brace your foot against this rock and hold on with all your weight." "Understand?" She nodded, her face set with determination. She wedged her good foot against the base of the rock, the rough surface biting into her boot leather, and gripped the thick, wet hemp rope with both hands until her knuckles were white. She was the anchor. Silas gave her one last, quick look, a look of trust, before turning to face the tree. He was a master of his craft. He moved around the giant pine, his boots sinking into the mud, reading the bark, the lean, the pull of the wind. He seemed to be having a silent conversation with the ancient tree. Then he swung the axe. The first blow landed with a percussive thwack that cut through the drone of the storm. White chips of wood flew into the air. He swung again and again, establishing a rhythm that was both powerful and precise. He was not hacking at the tree. He was sculpting it, carving a deep, wedge-shaped notch on the side facing the creek. The work was brutal, punishing. Rain streamed down his face, mixing with the sweat that beaded on his brow, but his focus never wavered. Elspeth watched, her own muscles aching in sympathy. Her world shrank to the rope in her hands, the wind on her face, and the sight of this man battling the elements. She had never witnessed such raw, physical competence, such a direct and powerful will being imposed upon the world. He was everything Mr. Abernathy was not, strong where the other was soft, brave where the other was cowardly, resolute where the other was dismissive. After what felt like an hour, but was likely only 20 minutes, he had carved a huge wedge from the trunk, a gaping mouth aimed at the far bank. He threw down the axe and picked up the crosscut saw, its long, serrated blade glinting in the gloom. This was the final, most dangerous part. "Watch the wind," he yelled, his voice strained with effort. He set the saw into the back of the tree, opposite the wedge, and began to pull. The saw bit into the wood with a high, rasping shriek. Elspeth's gaze flew to the top of the pine, watching the way its highest branches swayed against the bruised sky. The wind was gusting, pushing the tree back, away from the creek. "It's pushing west," she screamed, the words torn from her throat. "Away from the water." Silas grunted, adjusting his stance, changing the angle of his pull to compensate. The saw sang its terrible song. He was a blur of motion, his powerful back and shoulders straining with every stroke. Wood fibers groaned in protest. A deep, resonant cracking sound echoed from the heart of the tree. It was beginning to give. "It's shifting," Elspeth yelled again, her voice cracking. "The gust is dying. It's starting to lean true." That was the signal he needed. With a final, mighty heave, he pulled the saw clear and scrambled back, yelling, "Timber!" For a heart-stopping second, the giant pine seemed to hang in the air, defying gravity. Then, with a sound like the world tearing in two, it began to fall. It moved in a slow, majestic arc, its great height seeming to stretch out forever. The groaning of the wood became a final, explosive crack. Branches snapped, and the air was filled with the scent of pine, pitch, and shattered wood. Elspeth held her breath, her grip on the rope so tight her arms trembled. The tree slammed down across the chasm. The impact shook the very ground beneath her feet. The massive trunk hit the far bank with a cataclysmic boom, sending a spray of rock and mud high into the air. It bounced once, a terrifying, shuddering motion, and then settled, wedged securely between the two banks. It was a bridge, a crude, terrifying, magnificent bridge spanning the roaring torrent below. Silas stood, chest heaving, leaning on his saw. He looked at the bridge, then back at her. A slow grin of triumph spread across his rain-streaked, exhausted face. They had done it. They had defied the storm. They had built their path. The bridge was a terrifying sight. The massive pine trunk, stripped of most of its lower branches in the fall, was slick with rain and vibrating with the force of the water raging just a few feet beneath it. It was wider than a man's shoulders, but offered no handholds, no security, only a raw, rounded surface over a deadly drop. "We have to move now," Silas shouted, already coiling the rope he had retrieved. "That log won't hold forever. The surge will tear it loose." He strode to the edge of the creek, looped the rope around the base of the fallen tree's stump, and tied a knot with a swift, practiced efficiency that spoke of a lifetime of such tasks. He handed the other end of the rope to Elspeth. "Hold this. Don't follow me yet." Without another word, he stepped onto the log. He moved with a woodsman's balance, his boots finding purchase on the slick bark, his body low and centered. He didn't look down. His focus was entirely on the other side. Hand over hand, he pulled himself along the guide rope he'd strung across, a safety line in the maelstrom. It was a harrowing crossing, the spray from the torrent soaking him, the log trembling beneath him, but in less than a minute he was on the other side, securing the rope to the trunk of the twin pine. He had created a single, taut handrail across the abyss. He turned and started back for her. Watching him recross the chasm, coming toward her, Elspeth felt a wave of dizziness that had nothing to do with her injury. He was risking his life, not once, but 3 times for a town that was not his and a woman he barely knew. When he was back on her side of the bank, he looked at her crutches, then at her splinted leg, and his expression was grim. "You can't walk it. The crutches won't work on the log, and your leg won't support you." The truth of his words was a cold weight in her stomach. After all this, was she to be the one to hold him back? "Then you go," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor of fear. "Go. Run. You can still make it in time. Warn them." Silas looked at her as if she had just suggested he fly. The thought of leaving her behind was so foreign, so utterly unacceptable, it didn't even register as a possibility. He had not built a bridge to abandon the person who inspired it. "Don't be a fool," he said, his tone rough with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "We started this together. We finish it together." Before she could protest, before she could even process his words, he moved. He crouched down in front of her, his back to her. "Get on." "What?" she gasped, shocked. "Get on my back," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Wrap your arms around my neck and hold on tight. Don't let go, no matter what." "Can you do that?" The intimacy of the act was staggering, but there was no time for modesty or hesitation. The log shuddered as a particularly large piece of debris struck it from below. Swallowing her fear, she looped her arms around his neck, pressing her body against his strong, broad back. He adjusted her weight, his hands gripping her legs just above the knees to secure her, being careful of her injured one. Then, with a grunt of pure muscular effort, he stood. The world tilted as he took the first step onto the log. Elspeth squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face against the rough wool of his coat, which smelled of rain, pine, and honest sweat. All she could hear was the thunder of the water below them, a hungry, waiting beast. All she could feel was the solid, steady movement of the man carrying her, his every muscle straining to maintain their balance. He was her entire world in that moment. His strength was her safety. His balance was her survival. She could feel the tense cords of his neck against her arms, the powerful flex of his back with each careful step. He moved slowly, deliberately, one foot placed perfectly in front of the other. He used the guide rope not for support, but as a reference, his hands gripping it lightly as he navigated the treacherous trunk. Halfway across, a gust of wind slammed into them, trying to tear them from their precarious perch. Elspeth gasped, her grip tightening convulsively. She felt Silas plant his feet, his body becoming an unmovable anchor against the gale. He didn't waver. He simply waited for the gust to pass, a silent, granite statue in the heart of the storm, and then he continued on. She dared to open her eyes. Below them, the water was a dizzying, hypnotic blur of motion. It was terrifying, but seeing his absolute focus, the fierce concentration etched onto the side of his face, she felt her own fear recede, replaced by a profound and overwhelming trust. He was carrying her over the abyss, not just literally, but metaphorically. He was carrying her past her failure, her rejection, her despair. When his boot finally hit the solid ground of the far bank, the feeling of relief was so immense it was like a physical blow. He didn't set her down immediately. He walked a dozen yards inland, away from the roaring chaos of the creek, before finally, gently, lowering her to her feet. She leaned against him, her legs trembling too much to support her. Behind them, there was a sound like a cannon shot. They both turned in time to see the Great Pine Bridge, their miracle of engineering, shudder violently as the full force of the flood surge, a dark, churning wall of water, logs, and debris, slammed into it. The log held for a bare second, and then, with a great, splintering groan, it was torn from its moorings and swallowed by the flood, disappearing into the brown chaos as if it had never been. They had crossed just in time. They stared at the place where their bridge had been, then looked at each other. They were soaked, exhausted, and covered in mud, but they were on the right side of the river. They were alive, and they were together. Without thinking, Elspeth reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she whispered, the words utterly insufficient for the magnitude of what he had done. Silas just nodded, his gaze holding hers for a long moment. Then he looked toward the low hills that shielded Hallows Creek from view. "The race isn't over yet," he said, his voice grim. "Let's go." The remaining miles were a blur of desperate, stumbling haste. The terrain on this side of the creek was less rugged, rolling hills and open pastureland, but the ground was saturated, the mud thick and greedy, sucking at their boots with every step. Silas all but carried Elspeth, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, her arm slung over his shoulders, taking most of her weight as she hopped and dragged her splinted leg. They were a single, three-legged creature, moving with a frantic, ungainly rhythm. Behind them, they could hear the growing roar of the flood carving its path through the valley. It was a terrifying, motivating sound, the breath of a dragon on their necks. There was no conversation, only the harsh sound of their breathing, the squelch of mud, and the relentless voice of the water. They crested the final hill, and Hallows Creek lay below them. It was nestled in a gentle curve of the land, a picture of ignorant tranquility. Smoke curled from chimneys, a dog barked in the distance. People moved along the main street. They had no idea of the doom that was roaring toward them. "We have to hurry," Elspeth panted, a stitch burning in her side. They half ran, half fell down the slope into the edge of town. Their appearance was shocking. A wild-eyed, bearded giant of a man and a mud-caked, tattered woman in what vaguely resembled a nightgown over a ruined dress, her leg in a crude splint. People stopped and stared, their expressions a mixture of shock and suspicion. "The flood," Silas bellowed, his voice carrying over the street. "The dam has burst. A flood is coming. Get to high ground. Now." A few people looked nervously toward the hills, but most just looked at them, at their ragged state, and dismissed them as lunatics. A stout man in a shop apron stepped forward. It was Mr. Abernathy. His face, usually florid and self-satisfied, was a mask of disbelief and disgust as he recognized Elspeth. "You!" he exclaimed, his gaze sweeping over her ruined state with contempt. "What is the meaning of this? I thought I sent you away. Causing a public panic with this vagrant." "He's not a vagrant, he's a hero." Elspeth shot back, finding a surprising well of strength. She pushed herself away from Silas's support, standing shakily on her own. "And he's right. The Bear-Tooth Dam is gone. We heard it break. You have to get everyone out of the low-lying parts of town." Abernathy scoffed, crossing his arms. "Nonsense. The ravings of a madwoman. That dam has stood for 50 years. Sheriff, deal with these two. They're disturbing the peace." The town sheriff, a portly man with a drooping mustache, ambled forward uncertainly. "Now, folks, let's just calm down." But his words were cut off. From the direction of the valley came a sound that was no longer distant. It was a deep, grinding roar, the sound of 1,000 freight trains, and it was growing louder with every second. The ground itself began to tremble. The dog that had been barking fell silent, whining and cowering under a porch. Every head in the street turned toward the sound. Silas pointed a finger at Abernathy, his voice like the crack of doom. "You can stand here and argue, or you can save your life. Your choice." That was what broke the spell. The undeniable, terrifying sound of the approaching water. Panic erupted. People began to shout, to run, grabbing children, scrambling for the safety of the hillside they had just descended. The sheriff's face went pale, and he started yelling. "He's right. Everybody up the hill. Move." Abernathy stood frozen for a moment, his smug certainty shattered, replaced by a slack-jawed terror. As the first muddy tendrils of water lapped over the road at the edge of town, he finally broke and ran, scrambling inelegantly up the slope with the rest of the townsfolk. He didn't spare Elspeth a single glance. Silas grabbed Elspeth's arm. "Come on." He helped her up the hill, away from the rising tide. They found a spot among the silent, terrified townspeople and turned to watch. It was a horrifying spectacle. The flood didn't creep in. It exploded into the town. A wave of brown water, 10 feet high, surged down the main street, smashing through windows, tearing porches from houses, and sweeping away wagons like they were toys. The sound was deafening. The place that had been a peaceful town moments before was now a churning, destructive cauldron. They watched in silence as the water rose, inundating the lower half of Hallows Creek, including the prosperous general store owned by Mr. Abernathy. Elspeth stood beside Silas, the roar of the flood filling her ears, but all she was aware of was the solid presence of the man next to her. He had not judged her, not dismissed her. He had seen her, and he had built her a bridge. As the waters swirled below, the rescued townsfolk looked from the devastation of their homes to the strange, ragged pair who had saved them. They looked at Elspeth, not with pity or scorn, but with a dawning, profound respect. She was not the rejected bride or the cripple. She was the prophet who had walked through fire and flood to deliver them. She stood tall, her chin held high, the pain in her leg a distant echo. She had found her footing not in a marriage or a town, but in her own unyielding spirit. Silas looked at her, then at the destruction below, and then back at her. The town might be ruined, but something new and far stronger had just been built on the hillside above it. In the gray light of the following day, Hallows Creek was a heartbreaking tableau of mud and ruin. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a thick, foul-smelling blanket of silt that covered everything. Houses were battered, their contents strewn across the landscape. The main street was an impassable jumble of debris. Yet, on the hillside, a community, though shaken and dispossessed, was alive. A quiet, somber relief had settled over the survivors. They huddled in small groups, staring down at what was left of their lives. Elspeth sat on a dry log, her splinted leg propped up, a borrowed blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Silas stood beside her, a silent, formidable guardian. The townsfolk no longer stared at them with suspicion. Their looks were now filled with gratitude and a deep, humbled awe. The sheriff had approached them earlier, his hat in his hands, and thanked them with a choked voice, promising that the town would never forget what they had done. Mr. Abernathy was a broken man. He sat alone, staring at the muddy wreckage of his store, his face pale and empty. He had lost everything. When his gaze happened to meet Elspeth's, there was no contempt left, only a hollow understanding of his own monumental foolishness. He had discarded a treasure for a trifle, and the realization had bankrupted him in more ways than one. Elspeth felt no triumph, only a quiet, weary sense of justice. His judgment of her had been a reflection of his own shallow soul, and the flood had merely washed away the pretense. She was no longer defined by him, or by her injury, or by the tattered dress that Silas had discreetly burned in their small campfire last night. Her identity had been reforged in the crucible of the last 2 days. She was the woman who had walked 20 miles on a broken leg, the woman who had trusted a stranger, the woman who had helped save a town. For the first time since she had left Ohio, she felt a sense of her own profound, unshakable worth. Silas came and sat beside her on the log, handing her a tin cup of hot, bitter coffee he'd brewed over the fire. Their silence was comfortable, woven together with the threads of shared experience. It was a silence deeper and more meaningful than any conversation she had ever had. "My ranch is on high ground," he said, his voice a low rumble as he stared out at the devastated valley. "It's safe. The cabin is small, but it's sturdy." He paused, turning his clear, gray eyes to her. "There's room." It wasn't an offer of charity. It wasn't a proposal born of pity or obligation. It was a simple statement of fact, an invitation extended from one survivor to another. It was an offer of a shared future, as solid and unadorned as the man himself. He wasn't offering her a home because she was helpless. He was offering her a partnership because he knew she was strong. Elspeth looked at his weathered face, at the quiet strength in his eyes. She thought of the bridge, the magnificent, temporary thing he had built with his bare hands to span the abyss. She realized now he had been building bridges all along. A bridge over her despair with his simple kindness. A bridge over her humiliation with his gruff respect. A bridge over her fear with his unwavering courage. He had built a bridge from his world to hers, and now he was inviting her to walk across it permanently. A slow smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile she had felt in weeks. It reached her moss-green eyes, making them shine. She didn't need to say yes. The answer was in her gaze, in a way she leaned slightly toward his warmth, a silent affirmation that was as powerful as any vow. He nodded, a brief, satisfied dip of his chin, as if her answer was exactly what he had expected. He stood up and offered her his hand. "It's a long walk back," he said. She took his hand, his large, callous palm enveloping hers. As he helped her to her feet, she knew this journey would be different. There would be no pain, no desperation. She looked from the ruined town below toward the distant, unseen mountains where his ranch lay waiting. She was leaving the wreckage of one life behind and walking toward the solid foundation of a new one, hand in hand with the man who had seen her, truly seen her, and built her a way home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.